portion of Saga of the Swamp Thing, Alan Moore, Book 1, the Anatomy lesson. So the story starts, if I can find it, on this page, and we have narrations by the character Jason Woodrow. And I really liked his narration style. You can kind of tell he's a little bit intense, kind of crazy. He starts talking about, will there be blood? I like to imagine so. So you kind of get a sense that like something's a little off with this character, but throughout the story, it makes it really interesting hearing his narration. So we start, and it has this kind of cool visual. It starts like he's in blue, and then he's talking about blood, and like the blood, it starts to drip down, which is, I thought, really interesting to read. And then as we get into it, we learn that he's been taken out of jail to work on this job, and we're introduced to the character of Swamp Thing. And I hadn't heard of Swamp Thing going into this, but with very little context to this, I feel like the book set it up really well, and I could understand who this was, and they set it up in a way that made me think I knew what Swamp Thing was, but at the end there was a plot twist that I thought was really well done. So we're introduced to Swamp Thing, and Woodrow gets the assignment to kind of figure out what's going on with Swamp Thing. And we learn that the characters thought that Swamp Thing was a human turned into a vegetable, and that this formula was the reason for that. But then they discovered that the formula doesn't impact human cells. So now they're trying to figure out why this character of Alec Holland, right, of why he was turned into this swamp monster. And that's the job of Jason Woodrow, to figure that out. And you can kind of see, we have this character who's like this scientist guy who hired Woodrow, and you can kind of tell from the visuals and the style that he's this like overbearing, intimidating character. He's drawn in a lot of shadows and contrasts, and I thought that really helped me understand who his character was. And they also set up an interesting dynamic between Woodrow and the scientist, and it's kind of clear from the get-go that Woodrow does not like them. He refers to him as the old man, the reptile. So we understand that right away, which sets up for events later in the novel. So most of this is narrated by Woodrow, and there's not a ton of dialogue throughout the middle because it's mostly Woodrow trying to figure this out. And his input is kind of creepy. He says, "I remember clearly the moment I began to cut. I was very excited." So that really kept me engaged in the story, because instead of just like, this is what's happening, it's being said as this really dark, creepy character, which was really interesting to me. And you can see like these red eyes in this dark shadow, kind of pretty creepy. And again, like the drawings were I really liked this image a lot, with like all the blacks and the greens trying to figure out this vegetable man. So during these next couple pages, Woodrow is really struggling to figure out what happened with this man and why he turned into this vegetable. And he also, because we know that he was taken out of jail to do this job, he's worrying that he's going to go back there, and he will do anything to keep that from happening. So he's explaining that these like organs aren't being taken over by this formula, and he's also talking about his interactions with the old man, the scientist. And he's more so getting frustrated with this man, and he's very clear he does not like him, and he's growing more and more frustrated trying to figure out what is happening. And then we finally get to the point where he has this realization. And this is also really cool artistry. And I liked the way it kind of kept you in suspense, because we learn that Woodrow figured out how this man turned into this Swamp Thing. But we don't understand it right away. But we're learning his reaction to it, which is really cool, because we're understanding how he's thinking first before we really know what he knows. So he goes to the old man to tell him what he learned. And he starts talking about these worms. And at first we can't draw a clear correlation between why is he talking about these worms, what does that have to do with it? So I was really engaged because he's giving this explanation about why, like, his discovery. And it takes him kind of a long time to get to that final point, but you can kind of start piecing things together maybe and wondering, like, what does this have to do with it? And it sets up the really good plot twist. So he starts to explain about these worms, that this one worm was kind of educated and was able to run this maze. The other of these worms weren't able to until they cannibalized this one worm and was able to then complete the maze. And the doctor is confused. He's not understanding what these worms have to do with Holland. So Woodrow starts to explain more, and we get these really, really cool panels. The warm tones and the fire down to, like, the cool tones of the water. And what Woodrow explains is that this man Holland, an explosion went off in his lab, and this character Alec was dead when the explosion went off, but his body fell into the lake along with this formula. So Alec's body decomposed and then was eaten by all these microorganisms living in that pond. And when they consumed they consumed this formula. And basically it's explained that these organisms then built themselves up, organ by organ, thinking that they were Alec Holland. And we learn that Alec Holland was not a man who turned into this swamp thing. It was the microorganisms that turned into and thought that they were this man. So this was not a human that turned into something and can be, again, turned back into a human. It's a whole different organism, which is shocking for the doctor, but he doesn't really want to stay and listen to the explanation. He's saying, like, I don't need to understand how it works, I just need to understand the end result, which really, really frustrates Woodrow. So the old man pretty much fires Woodrow on the spot after he gave this explanation, which really, really angers him. So then Woodrow, we can kind of see in these panels, he's looking for revenge. He's angry. And this is a really cool panel that shows, like, this form that he's come into, and he doesn't look like a man anymore. He's now this, like, monster. And so he's beginning to think of a plan of revenge, because this man didn't want to listen and hear this explanation. He doesn't understand what's happening, and Woodrow's angry about that. So Woodrow is left alone with this scientist's computer, and so now he has access to pretty much this whole facility and the swamp thing in the facility. So what happens is this old man goes for a walk and he comes across the swamp thing because he thinks that it's killable, and it's not. So it's still alive, and it's very intelligent and it can learn things. So this swamp creature before thought that it still had a chance of becoming human again. And that was like its hope. That was the thing that it was holding on to, believing it could be transformed back into a human. But as we learned, it never was a human to begin with, so that can't happen. So this Swamp Thing ends up reading Woodrow's notes and realizing that he was never actually Alec Holland. So this really angers the Swamp Thing, and you can see in these panels exactly, like this was a very striking image, just this close-up of this plant's face, and you can clearly see its anger. And again, we have Woodrow's narration throughout this thing, and over, and he's just repeating this mantra, I'm thinking about the old man. I'm thinking about the cracking of his joints as he runs. And this is all very disorienting and kind of disturbing, his narration of this, because you can see he's orchestrating all of this to happen. He's orchestrating essentially the death of this old man because he was not treated with respect by him. He's thinking of the terror in his ancient heart. So all these things, and we're getting this sense of fear from this old man. You can see in this panel specifically how scared he looks. And before, this is a really good contrast, because before we saw him as this intimidating, powerful figure, and now he's just this really scared, terrified old man. And we see him running away. And then we see this panel, which is kind of like the climax. He's trapped in this facility, and the doors won't open, and he's trapped with this being. And in the end, it ends up killing him. And we have this narration, again, of, will there be blood? It doesn't matter, it's not important, it's just the dying, which I thought was really interesting. It really got me engaged, because we're not just hearing about this story of how the old man is being killed, but it's from the perspective of Woodrow, and he's a very interesting perspective on all of this. And then what I really liked was this ending last page. The creature has just killed this old man, he's leaving, and now we're back home with Dr. Woodrow. And he's saying it's raining in Washington tonight, which is the very first panel of the story. We have these images with the wine and the raining, and the close-up onto his face is the same as the very last panel. And we realize that all of this was from the very front page, it was a flashback, and it led up to this point, kind of. So we saw him at the beginning, and then it's the same place where he is at the end, reflecting on all these things that have happened. So going into this, I thought it would be this story about how this swamp monster came to be, and I thought it would have this resolution of him turning back into Alec Holland. But that was not what happened at all. Instead, Woodrow figures out really what happened to this swamp thing and uses it to kill this doctor. And throughout the whole thing, again, it's like all from his perspective, and it's really a story about him as opposed to the swamp thing. So walking into this with very little context about, the swamp thing and all of that, this is a very engaging story, and it definitely made me interested to keep reading, especially all the dialogue and Alan Moore's writing style. It was really intriguing, along with the visuals. And it was sometimes the explaining, there was like a lot of like science-y explaining behind it. Some of that was a little bit confusing at times, but in the end, it was all explained very well. Overall, I would definitely recommend this, and I would definitely be interested in reading more of his work and more about Swamp Thing, because all the components worked really well together. There was these definite characters, this definite plotline with the surprising twist at the end, and I thought it was done very well.